Okay, everybody, these are going to be our last set of notes for Unit 3 and our last set of notes for Semester 1. So, Unit 3, notes number 7, the peace after the war. So, we're looking at the end of World War I and the impact, the role that the U.S. played in the peace treaty. End of the war and Wilson's plan. On November 3rd, 1918, Austria-Hungary surrendered to the Allies. Germany also agreed to a ceasefire and signed the armistice that ended the war. In January of 1919, leaders of the victorious nations would gather at the Palace of Versailles outside of Paris to work out the terms of peace. President Woodrow Wilson would travel to Paris to ensure this. So he was actually our first president to travel abroad while being president, like during their actual presidential term. So here's a picture of Wilson. And so when he goes to Europe, he is greeted like a hero. There's lots of parades. People saw that the role that the U.S. played helped to win the war. So you see lots of pictures similar to this where there are flowers being thrown at him, people are clapping. So people were definitely very grateful to the US for their participation in the war. Before the war ended, Wilson presented his plan for peace to Congress. His plan was known as the 14 points. And so it really embodies his idealism, his progressive ideas, and we'll talk more about it in the next slide. The 14 points. The points were divided into three groups. The first 5 points were issues that Wilson believed had to be addressed to prevent another war. No secret treaties, freedom of the seas, free trade, reduction of arms, and colonial interests. The next 8 dealt with boundary changes. Groups that claimed distinct ethnic identities could form their own nations. The 14th point called for the creation of an international organization to address diplomatic crises like those that started the war. This League of Nations would provide a forum for nations to discuss and settle their grievances without having to resort to war. So Wilson presents his 14 points at the Paris Peace Conference. He tries to, get all the different leaders to agree to everything. And you can see that a lot of these are very idealistic. In a perfect world, we can reduce arms, we can have less armies, and we can have free trade and no secret treaties, but it requires a lot for countries to buy into this. But what he was most proud of was his idea for the League of Nations. He thought that this could really be a problem solver for the future. The Allies reject Wilson's plan. Wilson did not fully understand the anger felt by countries like France, Britain, and Italy. So the French premier was determined to prevent future wars. The British prime minister just won re election on a slogan, Make Germany Pay. In Italy, they were looking to hopefully gain more territory. So everyone else had a different mindset, where Wilson wanted to put things in the past, move forward, where everyone else had more kind of a vengeful viewpoint. The peace conference did not include members of the Central Powers or smaller allied nations. The Big Four, the USA, Great Britain, France, and Italy, worked out the majority of the details among themselves. So here is pictured Wilson with the British Prime Minister and the French Premier. Wilson conceded on most of his 14 points, so they didn't agree to the other 13 in return to keep the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the only point that would eventually be included in the Treaty of Paris. So let's stop and think. Why were Wilson's 14 points not accepted by the other Allied leaders? So the majority of them would require them to potentially give up some of their power, some of their authority, release some of their colonial possessions, and they were not interested in that. They also really wanted to punish Germany and make Germany pay for what they felt like was the cause of the war. Debating the Treaty of Versailles. On June 28, 1919, the Big Four and the other leaders gathered in the Hall of Mirrors of the Palace of Versailles to sign the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty created 9 new nations, shifted boundaries of other nations, and carved out 5 areas out of the Ottoman Empire. The treaty barred Germany from maintaining an army, required them to return the region of Alsace-Lorraine to France, and to pay reparations, about $33 billion to the Allies. So they're having to pay back what other countries have spent on the war, and having to rebuild the destruction and the cost that their own country has incurred. The treatment of Germany weakened the ability of the treaty to provide a lasting peace in Europe. Several flaws in the treaty would lead to causes of World War II. First and foremost, the fact that the treaty humiliated Germany by forcing them to take full responsibility of the war. So they demoralized an entire country. Many people felt this, including Adolf Hitler, who was a soldier during World War I. So it creates a huge chip on their shoulder that it takes them forever to, and they never really do, move past. The treaty ignored claims of colonized people for self determination. So here's a map to illustrate the changes of Europe. So the one on the left shows Europe at the time of World War One, and then the one on the right shows the changes. So we see the Austrian-Hungarian Empire no longer exists, so it's broken apart. You have Austria, you have Hungary, you have Czechoslovakia, you have Yugoslavia, other new nations that are created: Poland, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland out of Russian territory. The Ottoman Empire was also broken up into Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Lebanon, Palestine, and Transjordan. Opposition to the treaty. When Wilson returned to the US, he faced strong opposition to the treaty from Congress. Some believed it to be too harsh, others felt it was a sellout to imperialism. The main domestic opposition was centered on the issue of the League of Nations. A few believed that the League of Nations threatened the US foreign policy of isolationism. Congress was suspicious of the provision for joint economic and military action against aggression, even though it was voluntary. So they didn't like the fact that by joining the League, you are agreeing to protect other nations within the League, basically having this huge alliance. So we didn't want to have those types of connections. Congress wanted the constitutional right to declare war included in the treaty. So Wilson refuses to compromise. He wants to keep the League as is. Wilson had ignored the Republican majority in Congress and was unwilling to accept a compromise on the League of Nations. Wilson set out in September of 1919 on a speech tour to increase support for the League of Nations among American citizens. Unfortunately, he suffered a stroke on October 2nd, 1919, and had to stop his campaign. The Senate failed to ratify the treaty in November of 1919 and again in 1920. So this means that the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. So the League of Nations is started, but the U.S. is never a member. So let's stop and think. Why did President Wilson fight so hard for the U.S. to join the League of Nations? Well, first, it was his brainchild, it was his idea. He really believed in the potential of the League of Nations. And so while the League of Nations does not exist today, it is very similar to what the United Nations is. And so kind of this idea of representatives coming together to talk. And so he really felt it could be beneficial for all countries and really wanted the US to be part of that. The legacy of the war. When World War I ended, many Americans looked forward to a return to normalcy. They wanted to kind of go back to everyday life, get out of war, out of European affairs. At home, World War I had strengthened both the US military and the power of the government. It also accelerated social change, specifically with African Americans and women. In Europe, the social and political systems were severely damaged. Americans began to call World War I the war to end all wars. However, there were still unresolved issues in Europe that would eventually drag America into an even bigger conflict. So the Treaty of Versailles did not settle anything. So this is the end of the notes. You want to make sure to go back